Welcome back. I hope you've made the most of the time to build those contacts in the network. It's time for our third panel. We've had sessions on designing and implementing well-conceived supply chains, but the fact is things go wrong. Donald Rumsfeld said stuff happens. Who would have foreseen the finely shaped supply chains of companies like Honda being so badly disrupted as they were by the tsunami of March 2011? Our next panel is about how to cope with disruptions and things that go wrong and how to manage the risks that they might. As usual, the panel's bios are in your pack. And the chairman of this panel is Dr. Amira Khan. She's a senior lecturer in logistics and supply chain management at Hull University Business School. Dr. Khan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to John for inviting me here today. It's great to be back in Singapore, but also to be a part of, such a distinguished group, amongst which there's many people here that I've had the opportunity to work with over the last 10 years. And also to say thank you for giving me such an exciting topic to be the chairperson of. As John knows, I've been working within the area of supply chain risk management for the last 10 to 11 years. And I still feel it's a very fascinating topic. And what I feel like today is we've got a great distinguished panel here put together by John and his group. And what I'd like to do is keep this session as interactive as we can, because we've been invited here as experts to give and share our experiences and insights into the projects and the areas that we've been working within. So I'd like to take a little bit of a different approach to the first two panels. I'm going to, first of all, welcome the panels. First of all, we have John from Coca-Cola. You've got all the detailed biographies, so I'm not going to give it too many details. You have Catherine from Future-Eye, Professor Martin Christopher from Cranfield University, and we have Paul in between here from LEK Consulting. So a great panel of experts. What I'd like to do is, first of all, I'd like to share sort of my opinions on the new normal environment, just to set the scene. And then I'd like to ask each of the panel here, each of the experts in the panel here, to share their viewpoint and their experiences on what they feel is the new normal operating environment. After that, I'd like to really hand over to the audience and give you guys an opportunity to ask all the questions that you'd like to ask the audience, because as I said earlier, we're really here for you guys. And then we'll have a few more questions in terms of an inter-panel discussion. So in order to just set the scene, what is the new normal environment? Well, it could be defined as we are living in a radical state of uncertainty. Natural disasters, nuclear meltdowns, financial chaos, terrorist attacks, commodity scarcity, social media disruptions, deep-sea oil well blow-ups, rising nations, falling nations. We can begin to understand that the new normal is very different from the old normal. But how is it different? Well, in the old normal, there was far more certainties from a supply chain perspective. Supply chains were designed to be much more stable, they were slower, so there was more time to make decisions. We could plan ahead and we could forecast. And it was also assumed that you could predict changes, but today it's becoming harder to predict them. The old normal was deterministic, and we can argue that we've just gone through a period of what we call stochastic or probabilistic. The new normal, however, is a very uncertain environment and what some people have referred to as black swan. Now, just to add to this, the socio-economic and political changes have also contributed to the new normal. So the size, complexity, and the scale of risk that we're seeing is vastly different in 2012 than it was in 1992. Now, as a result of this old supply chain models, the old sort of models are not fit for purpose in today's complex and volatile sort of markets. They're not capable of dealing with radical states of uncertainty. The new normal environment, however, it requires businesses to redefine the design of their supply chains, a topic we've been hearing a lot of this morning. But it's also to develop what we'd call creative intelligence, where you develop not one, but a number of possible outcomes or solutions to deal with risk. It's not a matter of training to choose option A or B. What we need to learn to do is how to create option C to fit problem Z. Now, the old efficiency thinking, which was based on sort of rationalization and efficiency, needs to be replaced by flexibility and agility, adaptability and alignment, and most importantly, to embrace risk as an opportunity rather than just as a threat. But what we also need to do is create a culture for supply chain risk management and not just supply chain management. Now, there was a survey conducted by IBM, which was on capitalizing on complexity. And this sort of issue was expressed really well. What this survey really noted was that events, threats, and opportunities aren't just coming at us faster or with less predictability. They're converging and influencing each other to create entirely new situations which require unprecedented degrees of creativity. Now, modeling past events to deal with these issues and to predict the future won't work. As we saw in Japan in 2011, not one, not even two, but three natural catastrophes occurring at the same time, converging to generate entirely new, unforeseen outcomes which few, if any, models could have predicted. Therefore, the new normal requires us to be agile, flexible, redundancy and capacity if we're to master the kind of risks and opportunities that we're increasingly facing. Supply chains must adapt and embrace volatility as an opportunity rather than viewing it as a risk. So now I'd like to hand over to the panel and ask each of the panelists to offer what their viewpoint of the new normal environment is. So over to you, John.
Well, thank you, Amara. This is obviously a very interesting topic, and you probably heard that from my question this morning. The supply chains, and I like to look at it rather value chains. It's not just things coming in so that you can make or add value to it. It goes beyond that. It's all the way from your basic suppliers down to your own manufacturing operations and then out to your customers and consumers. That's really the scope of what we're talking about in the new normal. It's not that any single part of that is important, but in totality it's important. The Japan situation, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the disasters at the nuclear power plants, and the damage it created within Japan's infrastructure highlighted some of the complexities of value chains today. There's an operation in Japan that makes the silicon ingots for semiconductors. That operation made 40% of the global supply of silicon wafers, 40%, and it was incapacitated. So you've got an immediate shortage of silicon wafers that form the basis for semiconductors. The Thailand floods, Honda did final assembly for, I believe, if I have the number right, about 80-some% of Honda vehicles bound for the U.S., and they lost that production. Not only their own assembly operations, but other Thailand-based companies who provided parts and services to Honda to accomplish that. Toyota has admitted publicly that all the work they've done to make their supply chains, their value chains so efficient may not be the right approach today. They said that their supply chains, which they thought was pretty much the typical V that you have in your mind as you go up Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4, they said in reality it's more of a barrel. So you get up into the Tier 2, Tier 3 suppliers, and anything that happens to one of those, you find out that that Tier 3 supplier ended up supplying 40% of your Tier 1 suppliers. So it's this complexity of your value chains that is impacting most companies today. An event somewhere around the world has the ability and probably the likelihood to affect your operations globally. So I think that's one of the biggest eye-openers we've had based on last year's series of natural disasters, as well as social and economic events, the social unrest, the Arab Spring, what happened in Egypt, what's happening now in Syria. That's become more commonplace. I just read an article this morning about social unrest in Russia. So it's happening all over. As China's middle class starts growing, we're going to see more of that in China. So a lot of the areas where companies are looking for growth are experiencing a lot of social and political unrest too. Those are very hard to predict when, where, and how severe that will happen. But that's reality today. Coming into Coca-Cola about 4 years ago, one of the things I realized was that the company has a very complex business model. It also has a very complex cultural model. So coming into the company and trying to establish a value chain risk management approach, I couldn't use what you would typically use in a traditional approach, is map out your value chain, understand where your value concentrations are, and apply your risk identification and mitigation at those locations. So rather, we developed a process that then is deployed everywhere across the company, and then use technology to aggregate risks so we can see where the common risks are across the company. But in going through that process, it became very clear that risks exist in two primary universes. The first is internal, those that we have control over, that we touch. Anytime we get ingredients or materials in, we do some conversion activities and we ship them out. We own that, we touch it, we can deal with that. But there's this whole other world, and this is where the new normal is really starting to play. Those external risks. Coca-Cola is an iconic brand. Risks to the company can spread like wildfire in the social media. Those risks are not often founded in science. They're rather perceptions. And that plays into another concept about risk, is that it's really perception-based, a lot of psychology behind it. This world of external risks is the one that's probably the bigger challenge, because it's difficult to detect what a risk is, when it's developing, and how quickly it's evolving. Real challenges, real challenges. The whole psychology about risk, too, this presents some real challenges to value chain risk management, both internally as well as externally. We remember what happened last week as being much more real than what happened a year before. May not be any more relevant, but because of the way our brain works, it seems like what happened last week is much more real, and therefore it's going to be on our top list of risks. Probably not the ones we ought to be looking at or concerned about. The whole psychology of risk also plays against risk management, because risk management is preventive in nature. As humans, we're wired to react, to respond. Company reward systems are developed to reward those who jump in and solve a crisis, not to prevent it. How many of you have been rewarded for preventing a risk event from happening? I'm happy for you. Most of us have not. So that is probably, in my mind, the biggest challenge of any company going forward and operating in this new world of heightened risks, risks that are hard to predict, and trying to embed preventive mechanisms within your operations. That's what I see today as the new normal. Ask me next year, I'll have a different opinion.
Thank you, John. Catherine.
Oh, okay. So we're going to clap. Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting, because I have been working in this area for about 25 years, I think, of identifying issues that might, in fact, be high impact, high probability risks, and have spent a long time either not being listened to, or else not being listened to until the issue exploded. And so I'm sort of very familiar with the challenges that you're describing there, John. So when I look at most risk registers, I see that they focus on the things that I'd call hazards. They're about earthquakes, they're about explosions, they're about terrible things going wrong and lots of people dying, and the reputation implications of all of that. But very few have the set of risks where the majority of reputation controversies actually emerge out of, and that is the low hazard but high emotional reaction piece. Now that quadrant of risks is actually the one that most risk registers pay little attention to, and yet that's where the majority of reputation controversies come out of. And having reviewed lots of disasters from Brent Spa through to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the nature of the controversies are often that the actual level of expert disputation might be there, but there isn't definite certainty that there is a dreadful disaster about to be had. And yet there is an emotional reaction to that that is way beyond what the experts would see as a rational response. And in this field, it's a field that psychologists and communicators got together on about 40 years ago, and they identified that the reason why people were overreacting to some things and underreacting to others, and bizarrely enough asking themselves the question, why are they overreacting to the things that can't harm them and underreacting to the things that can harm them? How does that make any sense? What they were able to find in this field that we call risk communication is that there is two parts to risk. There is the hazard aspect, or the expert view of risk, and then there is the outrage, or the public view of risk. And both parts are barely correlated, and yet, as a result of it being barely correlated, the strategies that most companies employ to deal with the perception of risks fail. Why? Because when you try to prove that the hazard is actually low when the outrage is high, all you do is exacerbate the outrage. In other words, if you're not paying attention to the things that harm people or they perceive harm them, then you will just exacerbate the risk more and more. So how does that translate to the new normal operating environment? What it means is all the current public relations, government relations, industry relations strategies are failing, and failing in a dramatic way. Why? Because they're traditionally dealing with what you would call an apathetic audience with a positive message and seeking to influence them. But in reality, as John laid out, the external environment is starting to become more agitated. People are demanding more of a say, they want more access to information, they want more transparency, they want more accountability, and they're agitated about a whole range of issues, anything from palm oil to access to water to chemicals in food to genetically modified products, you name it. There is a level of agitation out there about issues that confront your companies. And the traditional positive spin, all that does is agitate them more. So what does that mean? Traditional PR, traditional government relations that go out there to prove that you're right and the rest of the world is wrong is actually making things worse, not better. So our insight around this is that in order to build a social license, you've actually got to seek to resolve the issues that the people are most concerned about in a way that would get you to an outcome that is a rational, hazard-based outcome. It's an evidence-based outcome that you want to get to. So we're not at all arguing that you should pay attention to things that aren't real. We're arguing that there are things that are real in the emotional space that you're just not paying attention to. So one of the things we've been doing is to sort of work out how you can sequence the way issues go from being not significant all the way up to being significant at a social level, so you can make sense of it. And what we've done is we've sequenced 6 key steps that any major issue progresses through in order to go from a radical, external, activist-generated idea that nobody in the community really pays any attention to, all the way up to a social norm that everybody now believes in and expects that companies and governments respond effectively to deal with those issues. If you are caught out in a position where you've got a new norm up at the 6th sequence of this change process in society and your business model hasn't changed to meet those expectations, you've got major sanctions and risks facing your organisation. On the other hand, other pioneers will be sensing those changes early on and doing something to radically adapt their business models to be able to reshape to deal with those new social norms. So we think it's critical to understand the outrage aspects of the emotional reactions that people have to risks. They're predictable. There's 12 key factors. You know, we've got 600 diagnostic questions. You can go and you can identify them before they happen, and you can manage it, and that you need to do that in the new operating environment. We think you also should be objectively analysing the way issues are norming socially, so that you know what kinds of issues might impact on your business models as they become significant. And finally, we think you need to be dealing with this at a cultural level and teaching your people inside the organisations how to identify outrage issues and how to manage outrage issues effectively, because the old PR methods don't work anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Paul, what are your thoughts?
So I come at this a little bit different. Obviously, the label consultant, and no consultant jokes today, please. But you know, my last 35 years, I've actually had 7-year itches. I stayed 7 years in consulting. I go into industry for 7 years, back into consulting for 7 years, back into industry. So you can either deduce from that that I've got a grand plan and I'm working at it very well, or I can't hold down a job. But with that, I kind of think about this. There's kind of 3 things that keep me up at night about the new normal. And the first thing I would say is I don't think the word normal actually is going to be a part of the vocabulary going forward. I think the first thing that you know, we have to think about is educating the financial community. The good news is that over the last 15 years, we've raised the profile of supply chain to the point that it is now in the boardroom. It now has a seat at the table. But clearly, there is still a tremendous amount of confusion on Wall Street. Wall Street think about supply chain in the context of cycle time, working capital, inventory turns, time to get new products to market. And supply chain is far more than that, as we know. So I think there's a big gap between the current understanding of what supply chain is and what it really is on the Wall Street level. And that's important because, quite frankly, this topic is in the boardroom. It is being talked about, and unfortunately, what it derives is the second issue in the whole expectation side, which is what I call the fad phenomena. And the fad phenomena is that I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, you know, Gartner came out with their supply chain top 20, and we all know that Apple was number 1. But one of the statistics that came along with that was Apple's inventory turns was actually 75 turns, or every 5 days. So what happens with that? Wall Street gets hold of the fact that Apple turned its inventory 75 turns, and all of a sudden they start labeling every company that doesn't do that as a failure, or puts pressure on the board of directors to sort of get their act together and get their companies to get those inventory turns up. So I have clients, and it's great for my business, because they call me up, their current turns are 4 to 5 turns, and they said, Paul, you got to help us. I got a board meeting next week, and I got to explain to them how I'm going to go from 4.5 turns to 75, because that's what Apple does. And that's a fad phenomena. That is unfortunately, it's a gap between understanding exactly what is going on, how Apple got there, the culture, the time it took. Another one of those phenomena actually is very relevant to this region of the world. You know, I call it basically the China phenomena, even though it's more relevant to Asia than China. But everyone has read how labor costs in China are going up through the roof. And all of a sudden, again, the board of directors in American companies hear that you better get out of China because you're in trouble if you don't. Labor cost is going up. No one actually sits down and says, well, what does labor represent as a part of the cost of goods? How important, is labor? And again, this fad phenomena. So first big key change that has to happen is we have to educate the financial community on what supply chain is. The second thing that we have to do is recognize that supply chain actually is getting more complex. Only a few months ago, Delta Airlines announced they're buying a refinery. What on earth has a refinery supply chain got to do with an airline supply chain? And how does any airline believe that it's going to run a supply chain or refinery the way they run an airline? We understand why they did that. You know, oil is expensive. Gasoline's expensive, fuel's a very large part of the airline costs, but the reality is that that reaction is going to have a long-term impact on that airline over time. And I think the thinking about how do I integrate those supply chains, how do I get alignment, there's a wake-up call there to be had. Amazon just recently purchased Kiva material handling systems. I think we can all understand why Amazon might have done that, because it makes sense perhaps from an overall product offering standpoint, but two very different supply chains. And again, one of the most well-written stories about supply chain over the last 4 to 5 years is the Boeing situation, where their 787 Dreamliner was 3 years late and $3 billion over cost. Well, the interesting part about that is they kind of got an airplane off the end of the production line that does fly. And it's actually a pretty decent plane for any of you that have flown it. So, they've got 30 different countries that are supplying components to that airplane. They've got, 50 major suppliers. It's one of the most complex supply chains in the world. So just imagine, they get all the tweaks out of that. That's a pretty impressive supply chain when all the bugs are out of it. The last point I would just say relative to the new operating norm is the role of supply chain. As I said before, it has moved up, and it is in the boardroom. It is having an active role. However, moving from a cost focus to a revenue focus is still a tremendous challenge for many supply chains. There were some great companies that gave some fantastic stories today, in this room. So again, I would say that there's great examples out there, but unfortunately they're the minority. There's a lot of companies out there that haven't quite figured out how to move themselves from a cost focus to a revenue focus. Moving towards the customer intimacy focus versus basically thinking about a warehouse and logistics operation. And I think the last point is that I would say is that we need to recognize in this new operating norm that not every industry is in the same situation. I work as a consultant. I had the luxury of working with clients across medical devices, pharmaceuticals, retail, consumer, industrial. And if you take, for example, consumer packaged goods, their margins are in the single digits. Some of the most efficient supply chains out there, some of the best expertise, planning, forecasting, all of that technology is absolutely done first class. Compare that with perhaps pharmaceutical or medical devices. The margins historically have been in the double digits, high double digits. There's never been a need to really focus on a cost-focused supply chain. So hence, now all of a sudden, the industry is changing, and all of a sudden margin pressures are becoming a reality. They don't necessarily have all the skill set they need to be reactive like you see in consumer packaged goods. So you're going to have very different levels of capability, and the new operating norm will need to recognize that not everyone will be at the same level, on the same playing field. And I would argue that that's a part of the education process with the street, so that when they read about Amazon's 75 turns, they don't call up every board in every industry and say, why aren't you there?
Thank you very much, Paul. And lastly, Martin.
Thanks, Amira. The starting point for my viewpoint here was actually triggered by something John reminded us of in his opening comments, and that is that it's still a relatively young discipline, what we now call supply chain management. In fact, the first recorded use of the phrase, we're now celebrating the 30th anniversary, bit of useless knowledge for you there. It was first used in a white paper by a consulting company then called Booz Allen Hamilton. They've now renamed their company Booz, which I think is a great name for a business. For some of us in this room anyway. And the important point about what they were saying, I'm sure lots of people were thinking about supply chains long before that, but we didn't call them supply chains. And this notion of integration, end-to-end, all the phrases that we're familiar with, really that's when it began. I guess, John, you and I were also Well, we were quite young at the time, but we didn't actually call it then supply chain management. When John and I first met, it was called PDM, Physical Distribution Management. Now, what's the point of this history? Well, I think the point is that a lot of what we thought was sort of hot and new and important was hot, new and important, but it actually related to a very different sort of world to the one we now inhabit, and we've heard a lot today about what those changes have been, and certainly there's an awful lot more coming. And to me, what this implies is that we need to radically rethink our whole approach to how we design and manage supply chains. If we think about the language that we've used in the past when we talk about optimization, for instance, a word that's part of the vocabulary of logistics and supply chain management, and we ask the question, what are we actually optimizing? Well, traditionally it's been cost, and often a very narrow definition of cost too. It hasn't really been supply chain wide. It's been very much focused on our own operating costs. Maybe the smart companies have extended that a little bit, and they talk about optimizing on service. But I'm going to suggest briefly, in the time I've got, that maybe we want to transition to an idea that says we need to optimize on flexibility, because we have to be able to sort of change far more rapidly. And hence, what represents today an optimal structure is not one that's necessarily optimal in terms of cost. It's optimal in terms of being able to move and change more quickly. And that's got all sorts of implications for the business. It's got a lot of implications for investment. Because one of the things that we've learned a lot, I guess, over the recent decade or so is the importance of agility. We've come to recognize that. Much of that focus on agility was on what I've now come to call dynamic flexibility, which means can we change quickly, particularly in terms of volume, in terms of mix. Flexibility in terms of being able to switch from making this pack size to some different pack size, to being able to ramp up quickly or to ramp down and so forth. Now, these are still critical and will remain so. But I think in this new normal, as we're now calling it, this world of volatility, uncertainty, and so forth, we actually have to go beyond that. So the next level of flexibility, which with a colleague at Cambridge University, we've turned structural flexibility. And just very briefly, what does it mean? What it means is the ability of the supply chain to be reconfigurable. Can we change the actual structure of our supply chain? And can we do this in a way which enables us still to, obviously, improve overall business performance in terms of profitability? Can we do it in a way which doesn't constrain us in terms of future actions? Because one of the themes that I'd like us to sort of maybe debate in our discussion here is how much of an appetite do we have to follow the line that some folks in financial planning have adopted when they talk about real options. And what we're talking about here is that we should be thinking perhaps in terms of the idea that says the best decisions are those decisions that keep the most options open. And we can buy options, we can invest in options. Now, it's not necessarily the cheapest way forward, but it can often be the way forward that's going to protect me when things happen that I'm not expecting to happen. We can develop these ideas later in our discussions, but I just wanted to sort of end on one thought, because what this idea of options is about, one of them is very much about the role of capacity. We know capacity gives us space, it gives us headroom. Yet, of course, there's little desire to invest in capacity that we're not going to utilize. So maybe it's not so much about capacity, it's about access to capacity and access to resources. So my idea of structural flexibility is I want to get access. Now maybe not to contradict what Paul said, but he was wondering why Delta had bought that oil refinery, which specializes in the production of aviation spirit. Well, one reason maybe is that there is a growing concern in that industry about access, right, to that particular scarce resource, without which for the foreseeable future no airline can operate. Now maybe it was a crazy decision, I don't know. Or maybe in this concept of options, it was a very wise decision. But maybe we can throw that open for discussion.
Thank you very much, Martin. And that's exactly what I'd like to do now. I'd like to open up for questions to the audience. But 4 very good points of view there on the new normal operating environment. So I'm very sure there's a number of questions.
Martin, structural flexibility. What does that mean? And how does that connect with real options?
Well, I think what it means basically is that a lot of our supply chains are fairly fixed. You know, with the bricks, we've used the phrase bricks and mortar already today. You know, they're set in concrete. We made decisions often 2 decades ago. If we take Europe as an example, if we want to be parochial for a moment, with the coming of the single market, many companies, quite rightly at the time, I think, said, well, we can centralize our distribution facilities, we can reduce our factories, we can focus our factories, we can go for scale, we can serve the entire market, because now the barriers to movement across country boundaries were removed or substantially reduced. So at the time, that was a pretty good decision for the conditions that prevailed then. The problem now is that things are rather different. You know, the cost of moving things is getting higher, for instance, whereas the cost of making things is getting lower. And you may be at a point where if you were starting off today, you wouldn't take those decisions, or at least in the form that you took them. So what I'm saying is that now we're in this period of uncertainty, which for all we know is going to continue for a long time. I want to take decisions which aren't going to commit me in quite the same way. So this may mean, for instance, that my supply chains will be less and less bricks and mortar. They'll be asset light. And it's back to this idea of access. I want to be able to access resources or capacity. It may not be mine. I may not own it. It may not be like Delta. Okay. It may be more like Zara, where I want to be able to use other people's workshops, other people's facilities. They're not my own. It may not be the cheapest solution, but as I say, it's the one that gives me the most flexibility. So that's basically what I mean by structural flexibility, and it's about keeping options open.
If I might just add to that, I think it's an excellent point. And using that framework that you just described, what I also see is companies, when they look at evaluating or justifying an investment, all of a sudden there's actually additional elements that are brought into that cost-benefit analysis versus the traditional buy equipment, look at a yield, look at an output. They're now looking at the product life cycle as another part of an element. So they're saying, look, there's a projected life cycle of 250 million units for this particular product. Let's think about the investment around that, which very much brings you to an asset-light, perhaps, structure versus buying a heavy, piece of equipment to justify the investment. So I see using that framework and bringing additional elements into the equation as another example of leveraging that.
Thank you. Got another question in the middle of the room here.
Martin, I just wanted to actually follow up on that question, because my experiences over the last 25 years, if I look at the automotive industry in particular, inventory has moved from the OEMs to the supplier base. So yes, Zara might be asset light, but somebody owns that manufacturing facility.
Sure.
So from a financial perspective, aren't we just shifting it to somebody else and giving that problem to somebody else? For the OEM, it might be great, but for the overall supply chain or value chain, what is the real value that you're getting out of that?
Well, I think it's partly to do with the ability to share, because one of the reasons why we want to access maybe other people's capacity, other people's resources, is that we can get the benefits of scale without necessarily the sort of rigidity of making that investment ourselves. Somebody was telling me the other day, if I can get this one right, in terms of a sort of hierarchy of best strategies. The first strategy was to borrow something. That's the best one, right? The second best one is to share something. The third one is to rent something. The fourth one is to lease it. And the fifth and the least favorable is to own it. And now that may be a little simplistic, but it sort of reflects, I think, what we're saying here, that if we can actually start accessing other people's capacity. Let's take transportation, for instance. We see quite a few fairly well-established programs underway at the moment, many of them on a pilot basis, but others on a more fully fledged basis, where we're actually competitors coming together. In the UK, for instance, under the auspices of the Institute of Grocery Distribution, major retailers, Tesco, Asda and others, along with major suppliers like P&G, Unilever and so forth, are coming together to combine in terms of how they use transport. You know, recognizing that between a third and a fifth of all movements on the roads of Europe are running empty, mainly because we made a delivery, we're coming back empty, is to say, okay, we can do this better. There's a better way of doing this. That's pretty obvious. But sharing resources in manufacturing. We see, for instance, the massive growth of contract manufacturing in electronics. Companies like Flextronics and so forth. We're all accustomed to this, and I think there's a lot of it going on behind the sort of scenes, which I'd like us to now sort of embrace, if you like, as a potential basis for this new model.
If I could add to that, I agree totally with what you say. I think in doing this sharing or co-packing or whatever you want to call it, I think we have introduced significantly new risk in our value chains, in that what we have done to make the supply chain or value chain more efficient by maximizing capacity utilization, if any one of those sites gets disrupted for whatever reason, you don't have the flex to absorb it somewhere else. And I think that all the work we've done in the last decade to make our value chains more effective, more efficient, has also made them less flexible.
Yeah. I want to speak to that as well as an example in terms of the way the risks might pan out from a public perspective, because in anywhere along a supply chain we've seen these sort of reputation controversies break the supply chain down. So if you're not in control of or understand how they're managing those issues, something that a company's decided will have a knock-on effect. Just as a number of examples, there was a paper company based in Australia who had customers in Japan. The Japanese were targeted by the activists, and all of a sudden the Japanese didn't want to purchase this Australian supply of paper because of the consequences of that. Or a major retailer didn't want to purchase anything from Indonesian rainforest anymore because of the implications on biodiversity and the activist campaigns that were there. And so all of a sudden their supply into England for toilet paper that was manufactured by a Chinese company in Indonesia selling into England was removed. So these are massive impacts on exactly where in the supply chain the risk is going to occur is unknown to you, depending on how much sharing you do about the non-technical risks that are in that supply chain and how they're being managed by those other parts of your supply chain.
We've got a few more questions in the middle of the room here.
In the other session, the gentleman from P&G was talking about teaching people how to deal with change. How are you teaching people in your organizations to deal with risk? Or are you?
John?
That's a very good question. And what we're doing in risk management, and it is a culture change because it's trying to get people to embed prevention into their business routines. What we're doing, and it goes along with what I heard this morning, keep it simple. If it's not simple, it won't be done. We're also standardizing around an international standard on risk management framework, which also has a set of vocabulary that is very clearly defines risk and risk terms. So taking those two, a very simple framework that has international acceptance and a common language around risk, is we are embedding that within the operations to get people to go through the exercise of identifying and analyzing risks and then putting the mitigation or optimizing techniques into their business plans. I always said that when I came into Coke, I judged my success by the need for my job not being there in 5 years. Well, after 4 years, I'm going to give myself 10 years to get to that point. It is a complex company. But the key, I think, is to embed it into the way the business processes that already exist are conducted and make it part of that. It's not a separate process you do off to the side. It's part of the way the business is run. And the other ways to get the change in place, of course, you need all the alignment of the senior executives. It's best to embed it into people's performance plans, and it's just teach, teach, teach.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that simple is good in terms of systems, but I think given that we've got a complex world, we've actually got to teach people to solve risk in complex context. So therefore, I go along with what Pat was saying in the earlier session around the importance of mental models being created. And what we do to teach people risk is take a frame of any particular problem and then put different frames of references around it. So as an example, we were dealing with a mining company that had 300 Papua New Guineans racing at them with knives, to attack 2 security guards. And when we came to dealing with the strategy about how to solve the problems, we looked at it from a security point of view, we looked at it from a community relations point of view, then we looked at it from a human rights point of view, then we looked at it from a sustainable development point of view, we looked at it from a point of view of a 1-year solution, a 5-year solution, a 20-year solution. And when you look at all of those different frames of reference, you actually get quite different solution sets. And what I think is vital for organisations to do in order to be better at risk management is actually help people have mental models around how you solve problems at all these different sort of frames of references with different time horizons, so that therefore when they're solving them, they're thinking, okay, well, whose interests are we serving, and what risks are we taking with which audiences if we were to only take a really narrow solution to this problem. So if we were only taking a narrow security solution to 300 people racing at you with knives, there are some clear, military, other sort of police type interventions. But if you were to try and take a broader solution and you wanted to get some NGO and media and other reputational benefits for that solution, how could you do that in a way that would actually solve the social issue and also give you reputational risk reduction? So I think for us, what we're trying to do in our capability building for risk is to teach people problem-solving reference points that build clear pictures around who you want to solve which problems with what level of certainty and what level of risk reduction.
Excellent, thank you.
One thought, Mary, if I can jump in there, that triggers is that, having spent, I guess, probably 40 years now in business schools, that's a bit of a sort of indictment, really, but I must have done something seriously wrong in a previous life. But you reflect on the sort of typical curriculum in a business school, and then you just respond to what Margaret's been saying about to deal with complexity, we need maybe a different sort of set of skills than the ones we normally teach. I read somewhere, I'm not a sort of into this, but there's 2 sides to our brain, aren't there? There's the left side, the right side. The left side is about analysis and sort of linear thinking and, problem solving in a traditional sense. And that's basically what we teach at business schools. There's lots of formulae and algorithms and, that sort of thing. Whereas the right side of the brain is much more about how we can see holistically and connections and thinking outside the box, all these other phrases that we use. And I rather suspect that most business schools, even still now, don't really cover those sorts of issues. So if we're serious, we've used this word complexity a lot today, and if we're serious about managing complexity, I think we need more of that sort of thinking, which means we require much more of that sort of training.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in there before we answer any more questions from the audience. I'd like to do get the audience to participate in a short exercise, okay? And what I'd like to do is ask the audience a few questions now. So the first question is, how many of you would say you actually work in a resilient supply chain? So I need the audience to participate in this now, okay? So hands up. If I can't see the hands, I'm going to ask you to stand up. How many of you would say your company has a resilient supply chain? I think we're going to have to get some people standing up because I can't see the hands. So hands right up. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. 7 thinks they're resilient. Okay. How many of you would say you actually work within a supply chain risk role? So how many of you are sort of working a risk role? Okay. Again, 6, 7 of you. Okay. How many of you would say your company actually has frameworks or tools that actually quantifies risk for your company? Wow, that's a lot more. Okay, good stuff. How many of you would say your company actually makes supply chain risk decisions based on intuition and gut feeling? Some of you would rather not say. Okay, excellent. Well, the reason I wanted to do that exercise was some years ago, McKinsey Consulting actually did a very similar exercise with some of the leading supply chain companies. And what they found was that many organizations think they understand the role of supply chain risk within their organizations and think that they're actually resilient. But when it comes to actually actively managing supply chain risks, often the decisions are made on gut feeling and intuition. And I think what prompted me to actually ask this question was the last question that came about, how do we actually sort of embed this risk culture? You know, how do we train our supply chains or the people work within our supply chains to actually embrace risk management? And it's a very difficult topic to address, as we've seen from some of the comments. I think what we're really talking about here is a term, first of all, it's very ambiguous to define, first of all. And secondly, the issue is that nobody really wants to take responsibility of risk management within organizations. And I think fundamentally what organizations are looking for is a quick fix. And we often talk about, well, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We're talking about moving sort of beyond the boundaries of the firm. So we're not just focusing on systemic risk, but we're also looking at risks beyond, risks in our environment. We're talking about issues like cyber risk, for example, which have now sort of implanted in our supply chains as a result of us using sort of information systems to actually increase visibility and so on. But in essence, we've actually probably increased our exposure to new vulnerabilities. So that's why I wanted to do a very quick sort of exercise to sort of perk you up a little bit and ask you to not be frightened to ask questions on risk. So I saw a few more hands going up there.
Yeah, I grew up at Procter & Gamble, 32 years. This is for John. The thing in supply chain was single source supplier. Well, what's the new norm now? It isn't that. What's the new norm, and what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts on contingency planning for suppliers?
I think it's absolutely critical, and I'll point to what Toyota is doing now. They are requiring their suppliers, all of their suppliers, to either be able to demonstrate that they can recover within 2 weeks themselves, or they have a backup supplier. And that's Toyota's new approach to have that resiliency. Now, in the non-alcoholic ready-to-drink market, which Coca-Cola operates within, we're rather fortunate in that our business model is distributed risk. We have about 1,000 bottling plants around the world, both company-owned as well as franchise-owned. So if any single bottling plant goes down, it's not going to kill the company. Where we do have concentrated risks is that ahead of those bottling plants, we have roughly 20 concentrate and beverage-based manufacturing facilities distributed around the world, based primarily on tax-advantaged locations. Now, the company is very cognizant of the fact that if any of those concentrate plants is disrupted, we better be able to back it up. And the company does have and has tested and is testing its ability to back up any single contingency outage around the system. So I think with any company, it's absolutely critical that you have and push back up the supply chain as well as down the supply chain, that there are contingency plans in place that can be activated. And it should go beyond just sending out a questionnaire saying, do you have something?
I would add to that that the thing I'm seeing is that the traditional single source model, when you put it on paper, looks to be low cost, but that's no longer the optimum solution. I'm seeing a lot of companies now sort of leave that low cost out of the equation and basically go with a higher cost supply chain, which has got risk mitigation built into it. And that's, but that's another phenomena that I think is more and more. I look at, especially in the U.S., I look at this the sourcing strategies of companies to China, to Thailand, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and I look at the initial analysis that says we've got X factory doing X product. However, when you start then to build into that, what would happen if wage rates were to change? What would happen if there was political instability? So then you change the strategy and you actually end up with a higher cost supply chain than that initial single source, but that's the appetite that companies have now versus try to squeeze that last few pennies out of the equation. So it's no longer a low-cost strategy.
Okay.
We all agree that there's a rather ambiguous...
No.
Still not on?
Yeah,
there
now
we go.
you are.
Okay, so we all agree that there's a rather ambiguous expectation that supply chains will manage and mitigate risk. But what amount of time should supply chains actually be dedicating to planning for what they know and preparing for what they don't know?
Martin?
Well, I think it's like an 80-20 rule, isn't it, basically? Planning for what we do know, because I think the argument is we know less and less about the future. So whereas in the past we were driven by forecasts, we spent a lot of time on formalized planning processes. Again, reflecting when I began in the business school, long-range planning was all the thing. Okay, and we'd see companies who had established units which the role was to plan 5-10 years down the road, even longer in some cases. Whereas today I think that's still a requirement, at least in sort of broad brush terms, but we've come to recognize now that it's much more about being able to respond to events as they happen, the things that we can't actually plan for, which means we have to invest in that capability. And again, in the academic world, forgive me because this is where I've come from, it's what some of the gurus call dynamic capabilities. In other words, saying the advantage increasingly in the future will go to those companies who've got more of these dynamic capabilities. They're better able to move faster. They're not committed to the status quo. Just very quickly, one case study which has been in the press just recently following the sort of sad entry into Chapter 11 of Kodak. Kodak is a company, of course, we know the reasons why they've had the problems they have. They got hit by the digital revolution in imaging. But it's not that they didn't see the digital revolution coming. They knew about it just as soon as anybody. In fact, I'm told they had patents pretty early on. But it seems, and I guess the full case has yet to be written, but it was their inability to respond to that rapidly. Whereas Fuji, a major competitor, hit by the same revolution, but responded much, much more rapidly, and is now apparently one of the sort of leaders in digital imaging in new areas like medical imaging and so forth. So it just suggests to me that the balance in the past, quite rightly, was about planning, where we got certainty. Today, it's got to be the other way around.
I would just elaborate on that, where one of the topics earlier on was about technology. And I think that's where technology actually is becoming a very significant asset. where we can leverage information, or where we can leverage data to create information, and where we can basically put that on autopilot or make that scalable, that's what I'm seeing out there in supply chain. And then what we're doing with those resources is we're redeploying them to those areas that, quite frankly, technology hasn't quite caught up with yet. So you need basically human interaction with that decision versus we can put the planning and scheduling and the forecasting more on the autopilot for many industries. So I see technology being a significant player in allowing us to basically reallocate the resources to more unstructured problem solving that is, around prevention versus dealing with the eventual issue itself.
Yeah, I mean, I want to add that there is also, just taking a societal lens on this again, there's also sort of trends that you can see inside any supply chain where there is a potential for a product that has some level of societal risk attached to it actually being knocked out of your supply chain, and therefore not being able to use it into the future. So I'll take an example, for instance, like the debate, for the way car manufacturers looked at the difference between aluminium or plastics, and the implications that had to the aluminium industry. Enormous downstream implications for them as there was a greater move towards plastics away from metals. That was in part a societal shift, and also because of environmental and social issues, their products started to be replaced. So impacts on that industry as a result. Another example of this is, for instance, the way that community as nowadays, water is now seen as a human right and has been registered as that by the United Nations. As water and the access to water of being 25 litres of clean water every day being a human right, any company that is seen to impinge on that, that's all your distilleries, alcohol companies, beverage companies, etc., are potentially going to be at risk sometime in the future from being able to access it, not because there isn't a commercial right to access it, but because there is no societal licence to access it. So these are high impact issues that I think you need to be thinking about in terms of the supply chain and be managing them really actively in terms of risk reduction in the supply chain early, because if you don't do it, it's very complex once it's actually broken apart, and it can be recovered, but it's very difficult to recover, as both PepsiCo and Coca-Cola found out in India, and Coca-Cola's experienced in Australia.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd like to take the question at the back first, and then we'll move on to here.
I'd like to ask the panel if they see any natural contradiction in the two parts of this new normal environment. In the early lead-in discussions, we talked about this very volatile situation that we now face. Volatility implies fast decision-making. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we've talked about risk mitigation and managing risk and contingency. In many ways, they're quite different mindsets, aren't they? One's a very fast mindset, it's quick decisions and using some of that intuition, using experience, and the other is a very planned mindset and long-term and stable. Do you see any contradiction, and how would you see that you manage both and achieve both?
Yeah, I actually see that as two sides of the same coin. The long-term trends are the macro events that you can see, and as you develop your business plans and your strategic plans, you need to be aware of those and adapt your plans to meet those. At the same time, you're dealing with the risks that are here and now, with which you have to be able to respond very quickly and make decisions very fast. Risks don't exist in one extreme or the other. They exist across the entire spectrum. And to adequately manage risks, and by the way, risk is nothing more than uncertainty. In order to manage risks in your value chain, you have to be able to detect, analyze, and respond to both the very near-term, fast-moving events as well as the long-term trends.
Thank you. I'd like to take as many questions as I can from the audience at this point, if that's all right.
One last point to that. Okay. I just want to add to that. There's a company that actually interestingly enough, attended John's conference in Shanghai earlier on this year that I think emulates the point you're making about basically quick decision making, but also mitigation of risk. And what they do is they're a security company that just monitor, regions of the world for any type of natural disaster or unplanned event, and provide as a service to their clients, with regular updates on there's a flood, or there's a tsunami, or there's a dock strike, and that information as a part of their service is given to their clients faster than you would normally get it from the press. So there's a technology use there of just monitoring data sources across the globe and providing that information to their clients to allow them to make decisions perhaps a little bit faster than they would have done. So they're more informed decisions versus reactive decisions.
Thank you. I'd like to take a question from the gentleman here.
Thank you. Because I'm coming from a country in high risk, and the continent, Greece, is in high risk at these days, and the continent in risk also, Europe, I would like to share some of my thoughts about risk. According to what I understand, thinking is coming from physical catastrophe or from human behavior. During the years, companies, under the concept better, faster, cheaper, and so on, accelerate their way of doing business. They produce products, maybe in cheaper ways, shorten the life cycle of the products. I don't know if this is something for better products or just to consume more. And this is a new way of doing business. On the other hand, Western societies, feeling of the prosperity, asking for more and more and more, and spending more and more and more. The third parameter is the financial system, which losing the criteria and gave money to the people, to the economies, in order to enjoy this new way of life. I think, with my personal opinion, that this is a case of human greed. And the problem is inside in our mind. Now we are talking about sustainability, and we are trying to find the ways to survive. First we create the problems, like the problem we have in the health, and then we try to find solutions to solve the problems, to find solutions to averse risk, for example. This is just some of my thoughts, and I would like to ask the prepositions of the people. Martin is laughing there.
No, I'm not. I'm sympathizing, Evangelist.
That's, by the way, that's what keeps my business alive, is all these problems. As a consultant, just keep it going. We love it.
No, I think I can see where you're coming from, and I think we all sort of share some of those concerns. But at the end of the day, I think we've heard it several times. Today's customers, actually demand an increasing level of customization. They want it their way, not our way. The days of Henry Ford, the first thing, any color you like, as long as it's black, those days have gone. And so I think it's this requirement, if you like, which is driven by the marketplace to provide this level of gratification, if you want to use that word. So that's where a lot of the complexity is coming from, as we know. And we've all tended to assume that complexity is a bad thing. But I think that we've got to recognize that it's like cholesterol. There's two sorts of cholesterol. There's good cholesterol, there's bad cholesterol. And I think with complexity, there's good complexity as well as bad complexity. The good complexity is what actually delivers real value, which is about saying, yeah, we can give you something which will actually do a better job, preferably at a lower price, and make our lives better, right? The bad complexity comes from the costs which we know has crept into our supply chains, often because we thought we were making decisions which looked good at the time, but it turned out to be pretty expensive. So it's not an easy one to answer this, and I can see exactly where you're coming from, Evangelos, but I think I don't have the answer to that one. I'm not sure anybody does, but let's see.
Yeah, if I could take a minute, I think I heard a more fundamental question there and concern. Are we consuming beyond our means? And I think a recent statistic I read, and I forget which country it is, the average debt per capita is $73,000 US, with an average income of $43,000 US, which means it's almost 2 years worth of debt per capita in that country. All the turmoil in the Eurozone, I think, has been fueled by borrowing beyond means. And I think, is that the question you were asking?
You're totally asking about how you have the creation of risk, who creates the risk, and then with the same mind, we try, as Einstein said, to solve the problem.
Yes, yes, yeah.
I mean, I'd like to address that too, because we heard earlier from the last session that there's an opportunity for you as supply chain experts to actually really revolutionise the way the world works, and that's one of the drivers. I mean, if we think about the problem being, right now we've got 7 billion people on the planet. By 2050 we'll have 9 billion people on the planet. If we consume at the existing rate, we'll require, as in a US citizens rate, we will require 5 planets, which the equation is, it's not going to work the way it's working now. So we do have to change, and the supply chain is an opportunity for that. As Interface found, which is a carpet company, when they started to look at their supply chain differently and take chemicals products out and start to do biomimicry in their supply chain, they found that they not only saved money, $250 million, but they also actually found that they were able to reduce the amount of landfill, improve environmental and outcomes for the world through that kind of renovation of their supply chain. Nike is doing the same thing. Post the sweatshop claims, they've now been taking out a lot of the chemicals from their shoes and runners and those sorts of things, and therefore improving the environmental outcomes there too. So there's an enormous amount of innovation that's possible in supply chain, and it's required if we're going to meet the challenges that by 2050 that the world needs to meet.
Okay. Question here?
Yeah, this is for Catherine. My dear P&G came out with a product called Tide Pods. Have you heard about that?
No.
Well, it's a Tide laundry detergent that in a capsule, and you throw it in the washing machine and it washes your clothes. And it's multicolors, and it's been ingested by some young consumers that have gotten sick from it, and of course the social media is all over it. How do you mitigate those kind of risks? How do you say, what are you doing with something that looks like a gumball and you throw it in the washing machine? How do you prevent that from happening in the new norm?
Well, before I was talking about the value of actually teaching people different frames of reference to look at whose interests they're serving. So, I mean, a very key thing for a consumer-facing business is thinking about, how that product might be interacted with by the consumer himself or herself or the child of the consumer. It's a great example where people aren't necessarily stepping into each other's shoes to think about exactly how it might play out. And if you did that, it wouldn't be too difficult to see what the implications are. One of the most amusing stories I heard, and I don't think I'm breaking any confidences here because it became quite public. If anyone recalls the drug that Pfizer brought out to deal with erectile dysfunction, they brought out the drug and they didn't do very much analysis of what the implications were, assuming that everyone would be happy with that. And what they got was this huge backlash from women who had been very happy for a long time and who were no longer happy. And it's a good example, isn't it? That there you are thinking you're solving one problem, you're creating another, and you really do need to have the ability to have mental model flexibility around, well, exactly what are the impacts of all the decisions we're making. That's really important.
Thanks, Catherine. Don't know how to quite follow up on that one. But any other questions? Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, a general question to the panel. So we've heard views about how there's increasing turbulence in the world, political uncertainty, scarce natural resources, etc. And then, on the other hand, there's also been the increased outsourcing by companies over the years with regards to manufacturing and actual operation of their supply chain. So there's two very distinct strands there, increasing the overall risk profile. Do you think generally that there's enough recognition within the industry as a whole, globally, of the risks that we now face? Do you think there's enough being done about that?
The outsourcing model is quite different today than what it was perhaps 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, it was a fad. Everyone was doing it. It was low cost. It was India for technology, or it was Asia for low-cost manufacturing. And everyone was jumping on the bandwagon because, again, board of directors were saying, we've got to get our costs down, and everybody else is doing this, go do it. I think, and what companies did at the time was they just literally jumped to an outsourcing contract. And a lot of companies I used to work for, the Accenture, John and I were at Accenture, grew very quickly as a result of these outsourcing deals. What happens today, though, is quite different. When a company is outsourcing today, they spend a lot of time in really understanding exactly what they're doing and understanding the processes that they're doing, and they're very informed now in what they're outsourcing. So the model actually isn't as attractive for the big outsourcing guys because the margin isn't quite as big as it used to be, because you would take what was a very ill-defined process or a broken process, you would charge to outsource that with a certain margin. You would then, if you were the outsourcer, you would re-engineer it and your margin would go up tremendously. Today, companies are actually being very careful in what they outsource, and I'm hearing and seeing more and more today, a lot of companies are actually even bringing back in-house some of the IT, some of the manufacturing processes. There'll always be, in my opinion, an outsourcing market, but I do think, to be fair and to give the supply chain credit, we're being a lot more careful than we were perhaps 10 or 15 years ago.
I think one of the things which I've sort of learned too is, as a result of our experiences over this last 2 decades or so, is that we can outsource the execution of an activity, but we should never outsource its control. And reference was made earlier to the Boeing 787. I suspect there's a certain element of that where the control of the supply chain was probably lost in the sense that we would use it now. And in a way, what it's highlighting is, in fact, the importance of supply chain management, because supply chain management, to me, is really about managing the supply chain, which means the relationships that we have to develop. And yeah, we will outsource, but we want to be much more strategic, obviously, in who we partner with and how we partner, and creating processes which connect, but which we remain firmly in control of. And I think that's perhaps, for me, the sort of message of what the experiences have been this last 20 years.
That's an excellent point, and one thing I would add to that is what you see in today's outsourcing model is you see a new organization created that manages the outsourcer, whereas 10, 15 years ago, just let it go and hopefully it worked. Today, you actually see a new organization being created. That's another big difference, which is...
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to summarize on a few of the points that we've made in our panel and also reflect to the earlier 2 panels this morning. And that is that there is this huge sort of contradiction currently within supply chain risk management of companies that have sort of consolidated their supply bases or outsourced arrangements. And as you're saying, we have very different sort of relationships with our contractors now. We're seeing companies using sort of performance-based logistics, so they're measuring on performance outcomes rather than on transactions. Very different arrangements within their supply chains. And as I mentioned, just to link with the earlier panels this morning, we talked a lot about design, and in both the panels, the term design was used quite interchangeably. The first panel was talking about sort of design from a more art and design perspective, and then we moved on to the second panel, where I believe we were talking about sort of designing the supply chain, so architecting the supply chain. And I think there's a growing recognition that the supply chain begins on the drawing board. And that basically has implications. You know, design decisions have implications for the through-life costs of the supply chain in terms of complexity, responsiveness, and also in risk. And what I'm really trying to say here is that I think there's several opportunities for us to recognize how we can actually start responding to some of the systemic risks, but also the sort of black swan events, the uncertainties that are out there. I've been doing some research also with Martin the last few years of looking at the role of product design within the supply chain. And not surprisingly, this has been an area which has been overlooked in research. We often treat these topics very separately. And Martin talked about right side brains and left side brain. I fortunately had the opportunity in my lifetime to use both sides of my brain, because my previous life I was a designer, so I've grown up becoming a designer and then ended up in the logistics and supply chain job. So I clearly understood the sort of challenges, the obstacles of actually aligning the product design function, which is generally isolated and neglected at that very early stage, and there's a disconnect across the rest of the supply chain. And that's quite shocking, given that research shows that 80% of the total costs in the supply chain are actually wasted at that very early stage. So I think there's huge opportunities here, and I think one of the things we've been talking about is this alignment between innovation and design and the supply chain. And I think over the next sort of 2 days or so as well, we'll begin to see we'll begin to explore some further opportunities and challenges of how we actually combine supply chain risk, or how we can actually reduce supply chain risk and enhance supply chain agility by better aligning product design across the supply chain. So on that note, I'd like to thank my fantastic panel here, and thank you as well for your attention. Thank you very much.